Hello. Welcome everyone to our first session of talks of the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. My name is Niara and I welcome you all. I hope you enjoy our lovely session. Just a few announcements. First of all, health and safety. Fire exit, pretty much only one. Go down to your right and you'll be golden. We are kicking off our summer season. This season we have 6 shows. We have Henry V, which is our free show, The Changeling, Don Quixote, Merry Wives of Windsor, and Romeo and Juliet, and A Kid Summer's Night Dream, which is a kids show, our first one, and are very excited to have it. We will be selling tickets at the end of the talks, and just so you know, you get a group discount. If you buy 4 tickets, you can pay £5 for each, which is very, very nice. So today we're going to be starting off with Elliot Huxtable, our artistic director of the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. He has been with us for 10 years already, and he has directed more than 30 plays, 20 of them for the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. So warm welcome to Elliot.
I don't know if I need to do the opening paragraph in which I introduce myself to you, but I might do anyway. So, my talk is Don Quixote, the first modern novel, Quixotic thinking, and Shakespeare's lost play. So, hello. First of all, an introduction to those of you who don't know who I am. As Niara said, Elliot Huxtable. I'm the artistic director of the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival, have been since 2018, but I've been involved with the festival since its very beginning, back in 2015. I've directed many, many, many productions, both in and out of the festival, as well as with other companies, both community and professional. Some of you might remember 2019's Hamlet, this April's The King's Head, among others, which we will be reviving at the end of August and the beginning of September. Big cheer from all of you, wonderful. Hey, there we go. Yeah, I was expecting that from you, Tessa, to be honest. Now, the festival has been a strong proponent of new writing ever since we started, staging a bastardised version of Othello. Am I allowed to say bastardised in the church? Cool. Well, it's a bastardised version of Othello called Iago back in 2016. We've done new plays by Kieran Barata-Hines, Charlotte Groombridge and Richard Yule, as well as plays lifting, in inverted commas, from Shakespeare by Niara Martins de Souza, Mabel Chambers and Amy Viente. All the pieces of new writing we've done in the past have had a strong influence of Shakespeare, by Shakespeare, with Shakespeare, however you'd like to phrase it, either being retellings of his works, as in Iago, an hour-long version of Lear that we did, or Magna Carta, featured the bard as a character himself, as in Margaret Thatcher, or Bard to the Future, which involved a time-travelling Shakespeare writing Ghostbusters Part 2. I really missed that show, it was a really good show. Or lifting passages directly from his work, such as in last year's Peter and Inez. With Hades and Persephone, the writer used iambic pentameter to ape Shakespeare's work, and in The King's Head we had a strong historical setting. Okay, that one has nothing to do with Shakespeare, but if the RSC can do the Box of Delights this Christmas, we can do a play about Charles II. And that brings me on to the topic of our talk, Don Quixote. Now, this does in fact have more to do with Shakespeare than might first meet the eye, but let's just have a quick look at the story. So, most people, hopefully, maybe, are aware of Don Quixote in some form or another, even if the only thing they know is that he tilted at windmills. Or in the case of Homer Simpson, they know that somebody tilted at windmills, but cannot remember for the life of them their name. But he's far, far more than that. The story of an elderly gentleman who's actually only 50. Like, the book always says how old he is, but he's only meant to be sort of 49, 50. Turning knight-errant way past the age of chivalry, has captured the imagination of playwrights, painters, filmmakers, and composers for generations. Ever since Cervantes wrote the novel, in fact. Cervantes wrote the first part of Don Quixote in 1605, took a bit of a break to do some other things, then wrote the second part in 1615, only a short few months before he died in 1616. And he only wrote the second part because a mysterious author, who has never yet been identified, published a Don Quixote Part 2 in 1614 and went around saying he was Cervantes. The story, in brief, is that Alonso Quixano, a 50-year-old nobleman, reads an awful lot of chivalric fiction and decides that he would like to emulate his heroes, such as, and forgive me, Amadis de Gaul and the Knights of the Round Table. He sets off with his neighbour Sancho Panza as his squire and encounters many, many, many adventures. These include the famous tilting at windmills, the massacre of a flock of sheep which he believes to be several invading armies, and beating the ever-loving stars out of a group of holy monks. After several setbacks that require him to travel home to recuperate, he decides to stay there, at least for a short while, and that ends the first part. The second part is pretty much the same, but also contains a meta-narrative. The Don Quixote from the fake part 2 I mentioned earlier appears to have been going around pretending to be Don Quixote within the real part 2 too. Try saying that 5 times fast. Part 2 also contains several nastier characters, including a duke and duchess who play many mean-spirited pranks on the pair, and the novel ends with Don Quixote back in bed, his body broken and battered by the many adventures or sallies that he refers to them that he has been on, and his mind broken by his many, many defeats. He refers back to himself as Alonso and dies with many of the main characters around his bed, telling Sancho not to look for birds in last year's nests, that we should look forward, not backward. And again, I want to go into a Simpsons quote, but I won't. And threaded throughout both parts is Don Quixote's love of a young peasant lass, Dulcinea, or Dulcinea, depending on what you want. As long as everybody practices it the same, it's fine. Who in his eyes is a paragon of beauty, and in the eyes of the narrator and reader is a plain, ordinary girl. Everything he does within both parts, he does for her. Right, now we've got that out of the way, I'm sure you'd like to know what on earth this has to do with Shakespeare. Well, the English translation of the first part of Don Quixote first appeared on these shores in 1612, and in 1613, so very shortly afterwards, we have records of a play by Shakespeare and Middleton called The History of Cardenio. Cardenio is the name of a character whose story first appears in the first part of Don Quixote, and whilst it could be a coincidence, especially since we have no record of the play other than it was performed, that's all we know about it, one piece of evidence suggests that it is not. That is, in 1727, a playwright named Lewis Theobald released a new play which he called Double Falsehood, which he claimed he had based on the lost play Cardenio, a manuscript of which he had acquired but never showed to anyone, which is very Book of Mormon-y. This play, very much acquirable today, like you can go onto Amazon or Waterstones and you can buy a copy of Double Falsehood, it's not very good, steals almost all of the plot from Cervantes' original story and features a few passages that could have been lifted directly from the Bard's work. The reason you've never heard of Lewis Theobald is because he's not very good. The story that Shakespeare tells, and by extension Cervantes, is of Cardenio, a young man who is in love with a young woman, who is betrothed to Don Ferdinand. He meets Dorothea, who is in love with Don Ferdinand. The pair of them team up to ruin the wedding and have 2 happy weddings themselves. The end. It sounds exactly like the sort of thing Shakespeare would write about. It had shades of Much Ado, Love's Labour's Lost, etc. We cover it in my production in July in about 2 minutes. But Shakespeare does 5 acts. Now for my play. Did I feel tempted to have a moment within the play where we pretended that it was a lost Shakespeare? Yes, I'll be honest, I did. But am I big-headed enough to put his name on my play? No. For a start, it's not that good, nor do I think that Shakespeare would make such bold references to Monty Python or the Navy Lark. I'm glad somebody knows what the Navy Lark is. I said it to the cast the other day and they all went, what? Apart from one of them. I can remember the exact moment I started to write Don Quixote. I was on holiday in France during the 2012 Olympic Games and had just finished the novel. You know how cool I was when I was 22. I was doing a lot of university drama in those days and had been looking around for my next play. The 2 ideas meshed in my head and wham, I started to write. One of the easiest things to write about Don Quixote, but one of the hardest parts to stage, so I curse my own name in rehearsal, is that it is very episodic in nature. This means that you can write lots and lots of contained scenes without having to worry with such fickle trivialities as character development, through lines of dialogue, or overarching plots like some playwrights. But it does mean that when you're staging it, you need to keep it dynamic and rapid, and you can't just have Don Quixote walk off and walk back on again, as tempting as it sounds. Which, if anyone's seen the ballet that was recently done with Carlos Acosta, it is just Carlos Acosta coming on, standing on stage, watching somebody else do ballet for 5 minutes, and then walking off. It's not a very good ballet. The music's lovely, but it's not really Don Quixote. It's you watching Don Quixote watch a ballet. So, anyway, how did I conquer that when it is such a and Don Quixote walked on a bit story? I decided to stage it in the round, a feature which I'm reviving for the production we're doing later. This means there's an audience on all four sides, and the action happens in the middle, in case you didn't know. The beauty of this staging is that, yes, nobody has to go off and come straight round again. You can just travel around the space without really actually having to travel. I love it as a way to work, but unfortunately, it doesn't work outdoors, as sound has nothing to bounce off, which is why we're staging it indoors. The characters, they came pretty easily. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are there on the page Cervantes wrote them. Easy peasy. Then we have the populace of La Mancha, and boy, there's quite a lot of them. I counted that there's about 100 tiny parts in the play, and so I needed a method to communicate that without a massive cast who all have tiny, tiny, tiny parts. It was Stanislavski who said there are no small parts, only small actors, and he was wrong. So I decided to use multi-rollers, 4, or in this production 6, actors who play those 100 parts between them. They will wear base layers of neutral peasanty costumes, hero shirts and breeches, and then they could throw something over the top quickly to delineate each character. I also needed them to be able to switch between those characters quickly, so the less costume the better. So a lot of the changes are done through physicality and voice too. Expect lots of dodgy accents and exaggerated postures. Looking at you, Fred. Actually, no, your Australian accent is good. It's everyone else's. This all gave... Don't ask why there's Australians in La Mancha. This all gave rise to a style which I like to call theatre ad hoc, which is what my company was called after I left university. I gave it up when, got the Shakespeare Festival with a built-in audience. The whole idea was that everything should look thrown together, that the audience should be watching a group of actors who are barely a few steps ahead of the script. To facilitate this, I quite literally dreamed up the characters of the stagehands. 2 actors who sit in one corner of the stage and both facilitate the play by providing the props and costumes, and act as a sort of Statler and Waldorf heckling. Going back to the Olympics, if I may, the last time this country seemed to be united over anything, I have a very clear memory of the opening ceremony. If you cast your minds back, that paragon of physical comedy, Rowan Atkinson, appeared as Mr. Bean during the ceremony and messed around with a piano. Now, we were in France at the time, and so we were watching it with the French commentary. Who is this Mr. Bean? Is he meant to be funny? Is it English? They think he is funny? And no, this is terrible. He's ruining that piece of music, etc. And that is almost verbatim what they said. But I remember it did have an effect. See what I said about dodgy accents? But I remember this had an effect on me at the time. I remember thinking, what makes something funny? And so whilst I wrote, I also studied a bunch of different comedic pieces of art, films, comics, television shows, radios, novels, and I stole from every single one of them. The other day in rehearsal, one of the actors kept stopping after a joke and going, "That is the oldest joke in the script," about a reference to something like, I think it was Round the Horn. And then 5 minutes, a joke about Shakespeare, going, "Oh, no, that is the oldest joke in the script." I promise a infamous Marvel No Prize to the person who comes and can identify the actual oldest joke in the script. I'm morbidly curious. It is a culmination of everything that makes my sense of humour, or rather that made my sense of humour me 10 years ago. It's been fascinating looking at it exactly 10 years on and seeing what made me laugh then and what makes me laugh now. It's similar, but not quite the same. Some of the references to things that I've stolen from, I don't get anymore. But the other thing about coming back to a work after 10 years is the absolutely riveting examination of what, culturally, was funny in 2013 when we first performed it, and what isn't now. I'm not here to play John Cleese, no one's favourite Python, and rail against the evils of so-called wokeness, nor to be a soldier in the culture wars. In fact, I think the fact that we in the festival are always trying to champion the downtrodden, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, or colour, hopefully speaks for itself. However, it was interesting to study this, and study myself, and to make alterations before anyone noticed. The importance of Don Quixote in world culture cannot be overstated. It can be understated. It has been adapted countless times into every single art form you can possibly think of. The brilliantly moving song The Impossible Dream is from the stage musical Man of La Mancha, which itself was later turned into a film with Peter O'Toole and Sophia Loren, and isn't very good. We saw it with Kelsey Grammer, and while he can sing The Impossible Dream, he can't act. Not on stage, he's far too big. Novelists, it's all the cocaine. Novelists, too, have been fascinated by retellings of the story, with Salman Rushdie writing one only, I think it was 2018. which you all should go out and buy to support him after his recent stabbing. Graham Greene, too, wrote a version set in modern-ish Spain, with Don Quixote's faithful horse Rocinante being recast as a Seat 600. Ballets have been written, sonatas by Strauss, and the filmmaker Terry Gilliam struggled to make a film about Don Quixote for pretty much his entire life. The two films that eventually arose from his troubles are Lost in La Mancha, a palatable documentary of the ill-fated original production, and The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, a transcendent examination of life imitating art, with the incomparable Jonathan Pryce as one of the leads. I really recommend you watch that one, even though Terry Gilliam is not a great person. It also has a profound effect on our language, unusual for a novel that was written in, well, Spanish. First of all, the word Quixotic has entered the lexicon to mean extremely idealistic, unrealistic, and impractical. One could say that many of my ideas for the future of the festival are, in fact, Quixotic. But that's the obvious. There are also two idioms that have entered the English vernacular from the novel. The first is also obvious for those who have been listening so far, which is tilting at windmills. It's an English idiom which means attacking imaginary enemies. The phrase is sometimes used to describe either confrontations where adversaries are incorrectly perceived, or courses of action that are based on misinterpreted or misapplied heroic, romantic, or idealistic justifications. I think somebody recently resigned from Parliament who could have been described as Quixotic. It may also connote an inopportune, unfounded, and vain effort against adversaries, real or imagined. Yeah, no, it's Boris. But also, did you know that the phrase pot kettle black can be traced back to the novel too? There's a scene in which Don Quixote, growing increasingly restive under the criticisms of his servant Sancho, bellows, "You are like what is said that the..." It's very wordy. "You are like what is said that the frying pan said to the kettle, avant black brows." The Spanish text at this point reads, and I'm not going to try and do Spanish, but it translates to, "Said the pan to the pot, get out of here, black eyes." It is identified as a proverb, or a refrain, in the text, functioning as a retort to the person who criticizes another of the same defect that he clearly has. Among several variations, the one where the pan addresses the pot as black arse makes it clear that they are dirtied in common by contact with the cooking fire. And it's not racist, which is what I thought when I was a child. To go back to Quixotism for a moment, this over-idealization or naive romanticism has been a fascination for authors and artists for centuries. We love a character or a world that is Quixotic. For example, the world that Star Trek inhabits is arguably Quixotic, one where mankind has set aside our violent nature and are embarking on a peaceful scientific exploration without the chains of capitalism holding us back. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? We love a delusional character who lives in their own little world. If you cast your minds back to very early on in the pandemic, many of us became obsessed with a TV show called Tiger King. Joe Exotic, the amusingly similarly named owner of a big cat sanctuary over in America, lived in an idealistic world where actions have no consequences, and he tilted at the windmills of Carol Baskin, a woman who claimed he was an animal rights nightmare. I firmly believe that one of the reasons we were all so caught up in this show is partly because we were all locked inside and had nothing to do, but it's also the whimsical nature of the Tiger King himself and how he reminded us all, consciously or unconsciously, of the Man of La Mancha himself. One could even argue that the subjects of John's talk, which I wrote this paragraph when I thought I was going second, Romeo and Juliet, are Quixotic heroes. They each have idealistic views of love, they make rash decisions, and they stay persistent to be with each other, despite all the obstacles they face. See, it all connects. To go back to the title of my talk, I think I've explained Quixotic thinking satisfactorily. Please boo me if I'm wrong, although I won't know how to explain it anymore. And I've definitely covered Shakespeare's play. But what I'd like to qualify and defend right now is my exhortation that Don Quixote is the first modern novel. First of all, I'd like to qualify it. It is actually the first Western novel. The Tale of Genji is also a claimant to the title, being a wonderful depiction of Heian, I think I've said that correctly, court life and classic Japanese culture, and that was written in the 11th century. However, as translations didn't make their way over to us until the 1900s, it cannot be claimed so in the Western world. So what makes Don Quixote different? For a start, it includes social commentary and literary critique through the use of characters both pious and secular. Through humour and irony, it made the reader question their beliefs, rather than simply entertain or reiterate popular ideas or history. As I've said, Cervantes published the first part of the novel in 1605, over a century after the Reconquista made Spain Christian once more. Pardon me. However, this was 4 years prior to the Moriscos, I think I've said that correctly, being expelled from Spain in 1609, Morisco being the term that applied to descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Cervantes was writing in a turbulent time, and he had experienced many slices of life. He left Spain for Renaissance Italy, and in fact there is a gallery of tapestries based on his work in the Palace of Naples, which I visited last year. There's lots of photos of me looking very excitedly at tapestries of Don Quixote. He also fought in the navy of the Catholics in the Ottoman Habsburg War, was enslaved in Algiers for a few years, and also imprisoned by Spain themselves when they found him abusing his role as a tax collector. So you can see why he didn't go back to his book for 10 years. These various experiences at this time led to much of the nuance that makes Don Quixote one of the first modern novels. The actions of Don Quixote undermine simple chivalric romances or morality tales by showing how following one ethical code without question can lead to delusions or immoral actions. Let me say it again. Delusions and immoral actions. This is not to mean that every priest is painted poorly, far from it, even though the Holy Brotherhood isn't put in the best light at some times. And no, not all villains are able to be saved, as the slaves set free by Don Quixote end up causing him even more trouble and beat him after death. This novel, in turn, uses the faults in the current culture's stars, so to speak, stars referring to knights such as Amadis de Gaul and others popular in 17th century Spain, in order to show the faults in the current culture itself. Now, this is where Cervantes' use of realism, illusion, and metafiction come into play. Some characters take the cultural stories seriously. Some are hobbyists, some make a living off them, some ignore them. Cervantes depicts a relatively balanced vision of pastoral life in his time, whilst using his main character, to humorously poke holes. It is through his illusion and his metafiction, especially in the second part, where this humour challenges the reader's belief in ways that works prior to this did not. Many are unable to tell from his writing which side Cervantes was on, having created such an insanely idealistic character in a realistic backdrop. Don Quixote's story does not tell a history, teach a moral, or promote a side, but it expressed the differences between truth and fiction, between reality and idealism. He provided no clear answers, but instead used his work to attempt to instill a type of critical thinking in his readers. Before Don Quixote, the last similarly realistic novels written in the Western world were in Latin antiquity. Major extant works are Petronius's Satyricon and Apuleius's The Golden Ass. I translated that one out of Latin. Don Quixote inaugurated the modern novel with a realistic representation of everyday reality. This is the essential element that defines the modern novel, as opposed to, say, the legendary or folk myth content of 16th century German prose like Faust. Specifically, Don Quixote is closely related to the novel type picaresque, which follows the adventures of a wily, clever character in everyday realistic situations. This genre originated with, and I apologize, Lazarillo de Tormes, published about 50 years before Don Quixote. While Don Quixote is often satirical, it achieves this through a realistic representation of everyday life and everyday lower-class persons. Technology played an important part in this popularization. Prior to the invention of the printing press, the vast majority of medieval books were ecclesiastical, as the production of books was by monks copying volumes by hand. As this work was by hand, books were incredibly expensive, they were luxury goods, and often beautifully illustrated, and so only available to the upper class. As this work was created in religious institutions, their focus was on producing religious texts. The radical change in book production brought about by Gutenberg's press meant that secular craftsmen were now producing books. And this, along with Don Quixote, was the essential to the coming rise of the novel. In the Renaissance period, i.e. Cervantes' time, dramatic works and lyric poetry were still the primary genres, especially from a sort of prestige standpoint. Dramatic works were both popular at court, but also with the literate masses. Literacy rates were much lower in the early modern period. But as books became more accessible, literacy rates rose, and those people needed things to read that weren't just about Jesus. Enter Cervantes. Right, I think I've prattled on long enough about the merits or not of Cervantes and his work. So if anyone has any questions, now is the time to answer them, ask them, and I might ignore them, but we're in a church, so speak now or forever hold your peace. I've always wanted to say that. I think technically I'm now married to someone. Not in a church, though, so it's fine. Any questions? Anything at all? Doesn't even have to be about what you just listened to me talk about. Oh, good question. We are doing Don Quixote on the 27th, 28th of July, the 1st, 2nd, 8th and 9th of August, all at 7:30, all in St Thomas's Church Hall. So above St Thomas's Church. Yeah, on Burgate. It's a lovely space. It's the Tuesdays, Wednesdays of the whole festival. I might have got the dates slightly wrong. It's the Tuesdays and Wednesdays. The tickets are available now on the Gulbenkian website, which is the best place to go. And also here, but I also work for the Gulbenkian, so it's a win-win depending on where you buy them from. Well, that's...
You mentioned the thing about Don Quixote's age being like 49, and yet this sense that he comes across in many ways, particularly in the second half, as being a lot older than that. How could you say, I mean, do you think the tone of the work and the tone of your play remains the same throughout, or does it change over time?
I think the tone of my play, it does get a little bit darker is probably overstating it, because I mean, he does die at the end. Spoilers for a 400-year-old novel that I think I already spoiled, but the second half, he suffers a lot more defeats more keenly, and I think in the second half, certainly of the novel, he feels his age a lot more. But I think the thing about him being really, really old, because quite often when you see him illustrated or you see him in films, like when Jonathan Pryce plays him, or I think John Lithgow plays him, they're always put in very, very old makeup. And sure, in those days people didn't live as long, but he was a rich man. He's meant to be a landowner, so it's not like he's had a hard life. And I think age does not weary him, or customs tales, etc., etc. You can tell I run a Shakespeare company, can't you? But yeah, no, I think the work does get darker. Certainly the second half gets darker, but I've tried to avoid the meta-narrative as much as possible in the play, because otherwise we'd have to have somebody come on and say, so, right, during the interval, pretend the interval was 10 years, and that somebody's written another play, and that play's been performed next door, and it would just get too complicated. Although now I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking it might be a good idea. The cast and the audience are getting nervous, because they've already realised they've put too many bad jokes in already.
Now, Cervantes had a very hard life.
He had a terrible life.
Probably the Elizabethan playwrights, certainly Shakespeare.
Definitely.
And so, from what comes across, it sounds as if it's really rather humorous, because it doesn't seem to be humorous. But actually, is it not really about very tragic?
Oh, it is, and I think it's the beauty of the ending of Don Quixote, where he realizes, wait a minute, I've kind of wasted the last 5 years of my life, and he tells his best friend, his only friend, you must look forward, not backward. He's talking about, because he looked into these books of chivalry and saw what he wanted to see and tried to bring that out. But actually, what you need to do is focus on where you're going, not where we've been. But it is as well. I think one of the reasons Don Quixote is so popular in the Western world is he's actually quite a British sensibility, this dark humour. We like laughing at ourselves, especially in hard times. Like, the Blitz spirit was meant to be this big cheerful thing, even though this country was getting bombed. And I think that's something from that is what permeates the novel, is that this man is doing ridiculous nonsense. That is, if you were to see it in the street now, you'd have them committed. If you were to see it in the streets back then, you'd have them sent to a sane asylum. But because it's in a novel and it's not real, it's funny. But if you stop to think about it, it's actually really heartbreaking. At least that's what I think. It's a tragic comedy. Anything else?
It's all cartoony, the RSC.
Yes, the RSC did made up a play and said that it was Shakespeare's play, but it's if I remember correctly, it is Lewis Theobald's play that they stuck a new title on and changed enough bits. If I remember rightly, I did read about it. I've read Double Falsehood, and it's not very good. It's a very much a. I'm sure Gregory Doran did a really good job with it. I'm sure the production was superb, but restoration comedy in general, in my opinion, isn't my favourite thing. That's why, for me, theatre stopped in 1615 when Shakespeare. No, I'm joking. There are other plays from after Shakespeare, but most of them involve rights, and we can't really get into that. But no, yeah, they've been much like it was just before the pandemic. The RSC did a play that they claimed was the sequel to Love's Labour's Lost, which Love's Labour's won, but it was just Much Ado. They just changed some of the lines in Much Ado and claimed it was the same play. I mean, they were very open about it. I'm not opening the lid on the RSC. This does just sound like I'm throwing shade at the RSC. But they performed Much Ado, but said it was as a sequel to Love's Labour's Lost. But it doesn't make any sense because Love's Labour's Lost is about 4 sets of lovers, and there's only 2 sets of lovers in Much Ado. I mean, maybe they all died between the 2 plays, and they thought, nah, I'll never speak of them. But as I never speak about my dead friends, so you know, it doesn't make any sense to me. And that is why this is recorded. The RSC are coming for me now. I've just shot my career in the arse. Anything else? Fabulous. Then I'll hand you back over to Niara. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elliot. That was impressive. Next up, we have John Moss, who has been with us since 2021. He has directed Macbeth. He has directed Sir Thomas More, and this year he'll be directing Romeo and Juliet and be talking to you a little bit about it. So give it up for John.
Thank you, Niara. I'm not going to say a lot more about myself other than to say that, I'll just say the first outdoor Shakespeare I directed was in 1980. I had quite a period when I wasn't doing any drama, and it's been a great privilege and experience for me to get back into doing it with the festival, which I admire for many reasons, and two, I would commend to everybody that it really is community theatre, and the fact there's a free show every year is part of that, and also as a group it's a genuinely open group and there are open auditions and anyone is encouraged to come and take part in it, and I really love that spirit of the festival. It's interesting you just mentioned Greg Doran, because that's who I'm starting with. A few weeks ago I went to see Greg Doran's last production for the RSC, which was a completely brilliant Cymbeline. You might, even if you didn't get an opportunity to see it, have seen in the media, because it was his last production, quite a lot of discussion about it and what he'd done. And it was hailed as a triumph, and I completely agree with that, having seen it. But it was, the way the triumph was defined was that it was kind of made clear that expectations were low. And why were they low? Mainly because Cymbeline is not performed very much, and so therefore there was a kind of assumption that it can't be very good. And there was a general thing you kind of picked up in the media talking and writing about it, that nobody really knew the story or what to expect of the characters. So I've started there because it's such a total contrast with the experience of directing Romeo and Juliet, which I would argue, if you put Shakespeare's plays in some kind of rank order using familiarity, or at least imagined familiarity as a criterion, that Romeo and Juliet would be at the very top of the tree. You might make a case for some of the other plays that at least people quote in everyday life, like Hamlet or Macbeth, because everyone can say to be or not to be, or misquote Macbeth by saying lead on Macduff, as people are wont to do. But there isn't really, for example, an internationally iconic location where those plays are celebrated in the way Romeo and Juliet is at Juliet's balcony, and in the much fated now, since all the things that have been written about it, the adjacent passageway plastered with letters, post-it notes and dried flowers that you can find in Verona. You could argue that Romeo begins the canonization of Juliet when he calls her dear saint the first time he speaks to her, and I think that process is continuing today, including among people who have never seen or read the play at all. So what this talk is about is the challenges that an audience's familiarity or imagined familiarity with the play make for a director and cast, and some clues about how we're seeking to address them in our production this summer, without perhaps telling you so much about it that you think you've seen it already and don't bother to come. So that familiarity with Romeo and Juliet comes a lot from its performance history and its most influential productions. And I think for the current generation, bearing in mind that most people first become conscious of the play and learn much about it at school, it's still the Baz Luhrmann film, which is now over 25 years old, and superseded without completely ever ousting the 68 Zeffirelli version. But the Luhrmann film is still the preferred film for classroom viewing. Now, of course, as soon as you start talking about that production, you start talking about perceived familiarity and perceived understanding. And many teachers, and I know there are some in the room, and I'm sure some of you will have torn your hair out when, having used the film to try to bring the text to life, you find GCSE pupils writing in their exam essays things like, Shakespeare makes Romeo and Juliet's first private meeting happen in a swimming pool, showing us how they literally get immersed in love. Or Shakespeare emphasized that Mercutio and Tybalt had a fight because they were too hot by setting the scene on a beach in the summer. And one teacher wrote an article about all this in the TES and included the not brilliant couplet, but nevertheless I think it's worth repeating for its purpose. For never was a story of more woeful misconception, but we can't choose to put the blame just on Baz Luhrmann's direction. Well, in that, the but, I think, is part of the quotation, because the teacher responsible then goes on to outline some common misconceptions about the play that have a much longer history than the films. And we may choose to snigger at people who think Shakespeare is responsible for things that obviously aren't his work, but do we know what all those things are? I think because of the long history of the play, it's easy actually not to be clear about what is Shakespeare and what isn't. So in fact, we would be just as wrong if we said Shakespeare places Juliet on a balcony in the scene where she first meets Romeo privately as a metaphor for the pedestal a goddess is placed on to be worshipped and loved from a distance. And why is that wrong? It's wrong primarily because there's no reference to a balcony in any early edition of the play. Indeed, the word balcony doesn't appear in the English language until 1618, 20 years after it was written. And some of you will know, as for the balcony in Verona, it's a 20th century addition to a 13th century house which once happens to have been lived in by a family whose surname happens to sound a bit like Capulet. Well, put those together and ka-ching for the tourist industry. Well, I think audiences might forgive a live theatre performance, and perhaps one in period costume, for not having a swimming pool scene. Although, just to go off on a tangent for a moment, curiously, I saw a production of Hamlet at the Sam Wanamaker Theatre a couple of years ago, in which most of the characters appeared to die by sitting in a paddling pool. I wasn't quite sure what caused their demise, to be honest, but so even in a traditional theatre like the Wanamaker Theatre, apparently you can have swimming pool scenes. I don't think we expect a fight on the beach either, but then you start to think, what are audiences going to be coming expecting? And if we're going to do Romeo and Juliet, is everybody going to go home disgruntled if they don't get a balcony? So then you start saying as a director, so well, should they get one if Shakespeare never wrote one? And what do we do with all these issues about what his intent might have been anyway? Well, if you try to work it out, it goes something like this. Juliet actually initially appears in the scene at a window. That's a direction that's in the text implied by Romeo's line, but soft what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun, ... Now, most critics think that would have been in the tiring house or the dressing room above the stage in the Elizabethan theatre. But although stage directions in some early editions include the words "Enter Juliet above" in some places, they're not in all the early editions, and we can't really be certain how the scene would have been staged by Shakespeare's actors. It seems to me, though, that it probably was Shakespeare's intention for there to be some kind of distancing device separating Romeo and Juliet in the scene through using this window. And then you start to think, well, in the Elizabethan theatre, could that distance between the two characters have been broken down? It would have been difficult to get quickly between the main stage and the tiring house window for either character in a scene of almost continuous dialogue. There's also no reference to kissing in the stated or implied stage directions, unlike those in the earlier Capulet ball scene. So if you remember in the sonnet in the ball scene, it's very clear that that involves a kiss and physical contact. No suggestion of that I can find in the text of the balcony scene. Later in the play, Friar Lawrence is quite clear about what would happen once the couple could get physically close. He says, "For by your leaves you shall not stay alone till Holy Church incorporate two in one." So I think you can sense that the distancing device of the window may be there, among other things, to ramp up but preserve the sexual and emotional tension in the scene at this stage. And then you can say, well, a balcony can, of course, achieve the same effect. And if people think it's a balcony, there are ways in which you can see you're probably being true to the text and Shakespeare's intention, as far as you can work it out, to have a balcony, even if Shakespeare had never heard of one. Then, though, when you bring the films back into it, things get more complicated in relation to what I've just said about the kiss. Because in both the famous films, the couple overcome that physical barrier and do kiss, in one case quite passionately in the swimming pool. In Zeffirelli's film, Romeo climbs a tree to reach Juliet in a very romanticised demonstration of passionate disregard for his own safety. Well, to be fair, we're told that he had done something similar by climbing the orchard walls to get into the Capulet garden. That's in the text, but it's reported rather than as something that is kind of signalled for enactment. And in the Luhrmann film, Juliet, showing more agency, She just simply comes down into the garden where the aforesaid swimming pool is. So while it seems unlikely that Shakespeare envisaged there being a kiss, we know that many in an audience will think there is supposed to be one, and will probably think we've got it wrong if there isn't, or they'll be very disappointed because actually that's what they've come to see. So I'm not going to tell you whether we're having a balcony or a kiss because I want you to come and see it and find out. But I now want to move on, if you like, from very focused, detailed examples like that you have to think about as a director, to some larger issues like what people expect Romeo and Juliet and their relationship to be like, and what people think the play is about, what in fact they're hoping to see when they come with their bags and baggage of expectation, and then how far can you take people away from what those expectations are. I've mentioned misquotation earlier, and I think Romeo and Juliet can uniquely claim to have as its most misquoted line, its most famous line. Comedians have written plenty of sketches on the misapprehension that Juliet asks, "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo?" And the reply that made me laugh most is, down here, stupid. Perhaps because it seems to allude to the Elizabethan staging of a nighttime scene in broad daylight, when the actor playing Juliet would obviously have been able to see him very easily. I don't think this ingrained error, because it's so much repeated, is just a misremembering or the result of people ignorantly thinking that wherefore means the same as where. I think it's the result of a kind of semi-conscious romanticisation of the play's central relationship. And for all kinds of reasons, I think some people, perhaps those who know a little about the play but have never seen it, assume that Juliet is the kind of archetypal abandoned female lover they know from other romantic stories, imprisoned, stuck up there away from Romeo in a tower like Rapunzel, yearning for rescue and seduction. And if all Juliet wants to know at this stage in the play is where Romeo is, it simplifies her, suggesting her character is totally overwhelmed by her feelings. And if theatre is escapism, should we just allow our audience of Romeo and Juliet to be memorised into thoughtlessness by the power of love? Well, the real meaning of the line, which is obviously why are you Romeo, and the whole speech, or a lot of it, then goes on to be about that, shows a much more analytical mind. It shows a Juliet who anticipates the problems the feud between her family and Romeo's is going to create even before her first private meeting with him. She's not an impetuous lover driven blindly on by passion. She's a thinker as well as being in love. And I think she and the play as a whole are written to make us think as well as feel. And I would argue that rather than the play being just a play about a feud and lovers battling against it, that if we start to think about the plot in words that highlight some of our preoccupations in 21st century Britain, there is an awful lot to think about. A 13-year-old girl, the text is quite explicit about this, marries a boy who is probably about 16, without the knowledge of their parents, but with the complicity of a priest, the boy's mentor, and a nurse who clearly operates in a loco parentis role. Meanwhile, the girl's father accelerates an arranged marriage for her at a time when he knows her mental health is weak. He threatens her both with extreme physical violence and to make her homeless when she refuses to cooperate. Her mother is complicit in these actions in that she chooses not to intervene on her daughter's behalf and then explicitly disowns her. The girl's advisor encourages her to enter into this second and therefore bigamous marriage. The boy's mentor encourages, aids and abets him in breaking the rules imposed on him as a punishment for a serious crime, leaving him vulnerable to execution if he's caught. The same advisor encourages the girl to take dangerous drugs in a plan that puts her life at risk in several ways, including by leaving her exposed and alone, incarcerated in a funeral vault, knowing that she has already threatened suicide. Unsurprisingly, the young people end up dead. Well, were anything like this to happen today, we know that there would be a lengthy investigation into the failure of the relevant child protection services. Well, for me, all this sits uneasily with a romanticised view of the play as being primarily about a context between love and hate, idealised love, and the stubborn idiocy of the feud. Juliet's certainly a child in modern-day terms, and Romeo probably is, and then if he isn't, we would have to define him as an adult having sex with a child. Some would argue that to highlight these things is to impose 21st century values on the play. They will say that lots of aristocratic girls in particular got married at Juliet's age at that time. Indeed, in the text, her mother says she did, and that this is not Shakespeare's issue. So if we're to move away from people's expectations about this simple binary love story, are we then simply imposing 21st century ways of thinking onto the play? I think the answer to that is no, and the reason I give you for that is that I think Romeo and Juliet's extreme youthfulness is a key issue for Shakespeare, just as much as it is for us. And I'll give you some reasons. Firstly, and above all, Shakespeare deliberately made Juliet 2 years younger than she is in his main source, which is a piece of work called Romeo and Juliet by Brooke. In an early scene, Capulet, Juliet's father, tells Paris, with whom he's negotiating what becomes the second marriage, the arranged match, that he wants to wait 2 years before we may think her right to be a bride. This intention then gets reversed, and the implication is that Capulet is at fault. Scholars, in fact, argue that it was very unusual, even for aristocratic women in Elizabethan society, to get married at 14. It was certainly very unusual in the classes that most of the audience would have belonged to. And where marriage took place at a very young age, consummation was not expected or encouraged until the couple were older. So Shakespeare clearly made Romeo and Juliet's circumstances exceptional, suggesting he wanted to explore the implications of that. Secondly, Romeo and Juliet both exhibit adolescent and sometimes childish behaviour in many places in the play. I think Romeo's conception of love, particularly at the beginning of the play, is entirely limited to lustful infatuation. He tells Benvolio that Rosaline, his old flame, has failed to respond to any of his sexual advances. And he tells the friar, and he even talks about offering her money. He tells the friar that the reason his affections have moved on from Rosaline to Juliet is because her I love now doth grace for grace and love for love allow, the other did not so. He's intoxicated by Juliet's willing and immediate reciprocation, but that is the foundation of the relationship. Later, Shakespeare couldn't be more emphatically insistent about Romeo and Juliet's recourse to their adult mentors and their total inability to cope with the situation they face after Tybalt's death. And if juxtaposing scenes in which their suicidal unravelling in front of these mentors was not enough, Shakespeare has the nurse spell it out for us, telling the friar when she sees Romeo bawling his eyes out, "Oh, he is even in my mistress' case, blubbering and weeping, weeping and blubbering," and she then calls himself to pull himself together if he is a man. My third argument is actually a dramatic one about the structure of the play. I would argue that the dramatic tension in most of the second half is almost entirely dependent on Romeo and Juliet's lack of agency and the failures of those who might expect to rely on the nurse, the friar, and Juliet's parents, and the decisions those characters make. I don't believe that it's ultimately the feud that destroys them, but failures in these duties of care. And I think there are other examples in Shakespeare of this happening, where despite what we're sometimes told about tragedy, that it's about the inevitable consequences of a single action, in fact it very often isn't. In this case, Romeo's killing of Tybalt could be seen as the single action that then leads to the inevitable tragic end. But I'm arguing that the consequences of that action and how they're dealt with by a whole range of characters, not just the protagonist, is really important to what happens. And to go from very young to very old, King Lear giving up his kingdom and with it his agency does not make his death inevitable. If it did, we wouldn't have to sit there through 5 acts of drama waiting for it to happen. It's his abandonment by those around him, following what some would call that tragic era, that leads to his death. And the second half of Romeo and Juliet, I think, can feel like a rather tedious working out of what is inevitable if a production doesn't choose to take great interest in the choices made by the secondary characters. Now, I think, in fact, that Shakespeare creates one set of expectations for us and then introduces and modifies them by the development of this second theme. And a final little piece of evidence about that. In the play's famous prologue, there is a lot about the feud and its implication for star-crossed lovers, love and hate and so on. And perhaps the only hint of any other concerns is the use of the word children to describe Romeo and Juliet, which I still think is interesting that that's there. However, in the last part of the final scene of the play, when the prince arrives, the play is primarily concerned with ascertaining blame among the mature adults who remain alive. And while the hatred of the Capulets and Montagues is strongly condemned, the person on whom suspicious of blame is centred longest is the friar, who's forced to describe his actions in a speech which is a really long speech, as long as Romeo's death speech, suggesting that it has equivalent importance as part of the conclusion of the play in Shakespeare's mind. I found myself thinking a lot when I started working on the play, why is this speech there? Is it just to retell the story? And I don't think it is. The prince acknowledges the friar's account of things by saying, we still have known thee as a holy man, when the friar finishes, but later he warns, some shall be pardoned and some punished. And that's certainly in Shakespeare's source, where the nurse is banished for concealing the marriage, the poor apothecary gets hanged. Well, of course, it's, as ever, it's the poor what gets the blame most, and the most severe punishment. And the friar adopts a kind of voluntary banishment, since being pardoned, he then chooses the life of a hermit for his future. Shakespeare leaves all of this unresolved with the prince's message. You know, some will be pardoned, some will be punished. But I think the fact that the prince's intention to take action is made clear prompts us in the audience to think about who is going to be blamed, who is going to be punished, and who is going to be pardoned, and for what exactly. And that points me back to all the issues about Romeo and Juliet's youth that I focused. So in our production, I won't say more than that we are setting out to show how those issues associated with Romeo and Juliet's age are as rich a theme in the play as the story of the lovers doomed by a feud that we think many of our audience will anticipate. In doing so, we hope to give that audience something they will expect and something they will not. And we hope you will be part of that audience. Anyone like to ask any questions? Right, okay. Well, those of us who work with CSF will know both that there are very strict rules about how long a show can be, and also that I have trouble with that. Okay. Which is my tendency to see everything as important. But Romeo and Juliet, to fit in, I mean, it's interesting they talk about the 2 hours traffic of our stage, because actually that's quite difficult to achieve, and the text is probably 3.5 hours long if you do the whole thing. So I've cut over a third of the play, with spending a lot of time poring over it. I mean, and Elliot and I actually had a conversation about this right at the beginning when I did the pitch, and there are 1 or 2 scenes that you can argue that they've got some kind of dramatic function, but it's not a very major one. Like there's a scene where some musicians are kind of getting ready for Juliet's wedding on the night when she pretends to die. And probably the main dramatic function of that is to give the actor playing Juliet time to go and have a glass of water. And it doesn't really add a lot to the play except a bit of a sense of passing of time. So I always find the first run through is easy, and there's stuff you can just get rid of quite quickly. The other thing that helps with Romeo and Juliet is actually, and you could check whether you agree with me about this quite easily by opening a copy of the play at random. There are a lot of speeches in the text in which the same thing is said not just twice but 3 times. And I mean seriously, the same point is being made 3 times. So that helped with the editing as well. When you've got past that, it gets harder. But I think that's when things like what I've talked about tonight, like what as a director you want to emphasize in the play, may guide you to leave some things in and take other things out that perhaps you don't happen to see as significant. So that's when some really quite subjective choices come into it. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, I'll get out of the way.
Thank you, John. That was lovely. Next up, we have Charlotte. Do you want to be called Huxtable or Groombridge? Groombridge. Okay. We have Charlotte. She's our managing director. She has been with the festival since the beginning, 2015. She has been the managing director since 2018. She is the backbone of this festival. Sorry, Elliot. She has been in every show. Last year, she managed to be in 3 shows in 1 season, which is fairly impressive. She also wrote The King's Head, which is an amazing play about Charles II that will be performing in the Arden at the end of August. And Charlotte will be talking about psychology and Shakespeare. So, welcome, Charlotte.
What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. Whether you love him or hate him, and if you're here, I'm going to guess love, Shakespeare has long been lauded as the seminal writer of the nation. His folio boasts of a multitude of plays and sonnets which, though written hundreds of years ago, still have the power to shock, to entertain, and to speak to their audience in a meaningful way. Some people will argue, and this is an argument which is wholly incorrect, that it is Shakespeare's masterful use of language which gives him this endurance. Yet the fact remains that many writers can create prose as beautiful and lyrical as it is empty of all real meaning and all real character. But I'm not mean enough to call out Marlowe so publicly. I mean, any of you choosing to watch Faust over Macbeth? No? Thought so. Now, before we go any further, this is about psychology, but I do want to put your minds at ease. Despite opening with Hamlet, the intention of this talk is not to focus on a Freudian analysis of the Bard's great work, for the simple reason of who hasn't heard that a billion times before. Hamlet and Gertrude having a fight in her bedroom. How Oedipal. Then he stabs someone through the curtains. Perhaps the sword represents his penis. I'm here to tell you, yeah, probably. Yeah, probably is. I've just summarised 50 years of psychology for you. You are welcome. I would also rather swallow hot coals than talk about Jung and his archetypes, so we're going to move on from that. What is psychology? Is it our futile efforts to understand the human mind? Is it our endeavour to predict behaviour and thereby manipulate it and change it within ourselves and others? Is it the desire to explain and excuse our actions, our thoughts, our needs? Is it all penises and sex? The answer is it's a little bit of everything, especially the penises and sex, if you're Freudian, which everyone's a little bit Freudian. To be serious for a minute, which isn't going to happen a lot, so do enjoy that while you can, the true debate that has plagued psychologists for decades is the question of determinism. To unravel the mysteries of human behaviour, we must answer this simple question. What is the true cause of behaviour? Taking a moment to info dump, because I do like to slip into teacher mode every now and then. Psychology, like any science, is not one discipline. It can be split into several different approaches. These are branches of psychology which take varying attitudes to the true cause of behaviour. For example, if you were a behaviourist psychologist, you would believe a human is born as a blank slate. Every part of who you are is learnt from your environment. As said by one of the seminal behaviourist psychologists, B.F. Skinner, give me 100 children and I will give you 100 different professions. This view states that we are not active decision makers in our learning, merely passive reactors to the world around us. The environment is what shapes us, and our desires and our choices mean very little. This contrasts completely with the biological approach, which argues that you and your decisions are nothing to do with the environment, but are in fact down to your genes, your neurochemistry, your hormone levels. You exist purely as a biological organism, as able to change who you are as you are able to change your genetic code. These are what we call the hard deterministic approaches. Free will is simply not taken into account, but they do give us a clear, if not limited, explanation for who we are and why we do the things we do. At the same time, they give us excuses for the host of terrible behaviours humans revel and indulge in throughout their lives. After all, how can you be blamed for anything if your behaviour is beyond your control? Social cognitive theory takes a more flexible approach to this debate. These psychologists admit that we are influenced and shaped by the environment, by the cognitive structures built into our thinking, by the restrictions and barriers created by culture and society. But here, we take an active role in our learning. We seek out information. We observe and absorb what happens around us, and we decide if and when we replicate what we have learned. This means there are still certain choices which are beyond our control. Not everyone is going to have access to the education or opportunities needed to become Prime Minister, but we are so much more than cogs in the machine of society, fixed in our role with no hope of changing our position. Each of these schools of thought have their strengths and their weaknesses. A behaviourist will say every behaviour is learnt, therefore any behaviour can be unlearnt, as you might unlearn a habit or a toxic trait. The biological approach offers us explanations for those parts of our behaviour which may seem beyond our control, such as the development of a mental illness. Social cognitive theory allows for individual choices. and understands that, as humans, we are not content to wait for information to land in our laps before we are able to change and develop. The central argument here, and psychologists love to argue, because I think that's what we're born to do, is just argue with each other, is how much control can any one person claim over their own behaviours? What is free will, and do we have any at all? Now, I'm certain you're sitting here thinking, I paid £5 to listen about Shakespeare, and I don't think she's mentioned any Shakespeare, what's going on. But I'm going to bring it back round. Because Shakespeare may be a master of language, and there's no question that he is. But what makes his play so enduring is he is a master of psychology. Shakespeare's true talent lies in his creation of character. When we watch or read his plays, we do not see random actions plucked out of thin air. There is little to no reliance on setting up conflict because the plot needs some way to move forward. I mean, in his greatest works, I have a lot of opinions about Timon of Athens. I'm not going to go into it, I'll be here all day. What we see, time and again, are real people struggling with the decisions they make or the ones that are made for them. These characters could be a young prince tasked with unwittingly avenging his father, the King of Scotland desperately trying to hold on to his disintegrating rule, politicians plotting the downfall of a tyrant. These may not be situations we encounter from day to day. I have no judgment on what any of you do in your lives. Take down all the tyrants you want. But they don't feel distant to us, even if we're watching a king, or from anything from a king to a clown, there is no distance there, because the characters' struggles with their own decisions are believable. We understand them. We see them echoed throughout our lives. Let's take Macbeth as a prime example. A skilled soldier with bloodthirsty ambition, told by 3 witches that he is destined for something greater, and pushed by his driven wife, decides to take his destiny in hand. Then, once he obtains power, finds he is unable to meet the task whilst juggling with the guilt of what he did to obtain that power. An excellent example of the Peter principle. I don't know if anyone knows what that is. It's when you are promoted way beyond your ability. I work with several Peter principle people every day, because it's every single middle manager anyone has ever had the misfortune to know. But when Macbeth sees his world crumbling around him, he doesn't cling to his talent or knowledge he has accrued from his years of military service. He believes he is safe because he is destined to be king, and that there are none who can challenge him. Be bloody, bold, and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none born of woman shall harm Macbeth. This brings us nicely back to the question of determinism. For Macbeth does not believe in his own power or agency to achieve his goals. And quite frankly, he shouldn't, since Lady Macbeth is forced to clean up every single mistake for the plan to work. Because wives are the best, even ones that murder your best friend, I don't know. Well, she didn't, but anyway. Instead, he clings to this idea of destiny. He is king because he must be, because fate has dictated he must be. And every death and all the pain he caused cannot fully be considered his fault. He is a victim of powers outside of his control, which inexorably push him to commit awful crimes. Very dramatic there. And just a little quote from a real quote I had from a middle manager. Look, guys, I know we don't like these changes, but the bosses above me said we have to do it, so don't blame me. That is Macbeth, 100%, and this is why I've never gone for middle management, because I don't want to be that person. Cassius, however, takes a different view. The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but within ourselves, that we are underlings. Cassius argues with Brutus that they must take responsibility, not only for their actions and any harm which they may cause, but also for their shortcomings as leaders, for their lack of ambition, and for failing to stand up for the people of Rome. For Cassius, the choice is an easy one: kill the tyrant and save Rome. He continually presses his point throughout the play, and we as the audience come to understand this man, who is desperate to assert the agency he believes they all have within them. If they do not act, they must bear responsibility for all that is to come. Inaction is still an action. Brutus struggles with the choice. He is unsure that Caesar is the tyrant others claim him to be. He doesn't want to kill Mark Antony and become a murderer rather than a saviour of Rome. And whatever does happen, he must come out of this experience with his honour intact to believe himself a good man, worthy to represent the people, which is a decision which immediately comes back to haunt them. Yet the audience can also sympathise with Brutus, caught between his honour and what he sees as his duty, knowing he is presented with a Hobson's choice. Any path he takes, part of him must be sacrificed. But he has to make a decision and hold on to the idea that it was the right one, regardless of what comes next. Caesar himself is wedded to the idea of destiny, and if you know anything about his life, it's easy to understand why. He was so angry that his ransom was so low, he made the pirates that kidnapped him triple it. So everyone should live their life with the confidence of Julius Caesar, is what I'm saying. He met with success unprecedented in his time. This in turn convinces both himself and the people of Rome that a higher power has decided he should rule over them. He is simply born a better man than any other in Rome, and very few people disagree with this theory, apart from Cassius. What is in that Caesar? Why should his name be sounded more than yours? Free will versus determinism. Macbeth suggests there are some choices which are beyond us, that drive our actions and shape our behaviours. Perhaps they do lie in destiny, or genetics, or in the social structures we exist within. Julius Caesar argues that men must make their own decisions and live with the consequences of their actions. And only when the tide of battle has turned and all seems lost, does Cassius waver in his resolute belief in his power over his own destiny. You know that I held Epicurus strong in his opinion. Now I change my mind, and partly credit things that do presage. Because Cassius is correct, psychology has recently reached this conclusion that our choices are not fully our own. We must take responsibility for parts of our lives, but there are factors far beyond our control, which force us into positions we do not want to be in, making decisions we know are wrong, yet we have little to no power to change our situation. The law, in its majestic equality, forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread. The argument Anatole France is making here is that choice is part of a social construct. We are seen as equal within the eyes of the law, but society dictates that men do not have access to equal opportunities, be that due to class, ethnicity, gender, or a myriad of other barriers. The poor man and the rich man both have the ability to steal bread, but only one will do it out of necessity. The other will simply not pay his taxes, but society and the law will only consider one to be a thief. The other will be the Prime Minister, or the wife of the Prime Minister, or any member of the Tory party. Moving on. If we want to investigate the role that society plays in our lives, two perfect examples can be found within Hamlet and Othello. Everyone remembers Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. Few remember that at the beginning of the play, he's actually returned from university abroad. And it is safe to assume that stepping away from royal life has changed his perspective. In any other historical play, the characters will jump to vengeance as literally the first solution to solving their problems. They don't even start, they're like, just got to kill this guy, that's going to sort all my problems. And if you look at the histories, kind of does, until that guy decides he wants to kill you. But Hamlet, they protect their honour and that of their family, defending themselves with shows of strength and bloodshed. But when the ghost urges this of Hamlet, he dithers. He hesitates. This is not the role he wishes to fulfill, merely one society has dictated for him. Hamlet has moved past the archaic structures of palace life, but there are expectations he is compelled to live up to, and in the end, he cannot escape the bloodshed. The old world catches up in one of the most archaic shows of strength left, a duel. But to my mind, though I am native here and to the manor born, it is a custom more honoured in the breach than the observance. Laertes, also a returning university student, is easily convinced to defend his family, though interestingly, it is the situation of his sister and her fall from honour that ultimately convinces him. A clear example of toxic masculinity. As the newly appointed man of the house, Laertes either steps up with a barbaric show of strength or allows the court to forever question the honour of himself and his family. And just like real life, these outdated beliefs lead to nothing but death and destruction. Society acts as a guide to our social interactions, and though we may understand how dangerous these behaviours can be, social influence is incredibly subtle and yet impossible to resist. From the opening lines in the play, Shakespeare makes it clear that Othello has been subject to discrimination from almost every single character we meet. The very first scene depicts Desdemona's father appalled at the idea of his daughter marrying Othello at all. Fathers from hence trust not your daughters' minds by what you see them act. There were more racist ones I could have picked. I decided against that because Brabantio has some horrible lines in the beginning of the play. Yet Othello is a respected general, returned from the glory of battle, and really should be considered a catch for any eligible woman in Venice. This is how Shakespeare sets him up as the victim of the piece, making his race a barrier to the regard so easily given to those around him, some of whom far less worthy of it. For Othello is a good man, crushed and altered by his unfair treatment of his peers, manipulated by one of the few men he trusts and respects. It is easy for him to believe Iago. After all, every character goes out of their way to explain how Desdemona couldn't possibly love him, why she is too good for him, surprised that he could consider himself her equal. Society has shown Othello time and again that he should expect nothing but abuse and disrespect, and that is the insecurity Iago plays like a fiddle. In my mind, one of the clearest signs of Shakespeare's genius is that the audience leave the play feeling sorry for a man who just strangled his wife in a fit of jealousy. We understand him as a victim because we have seen Othello's journey, his pain, and the discrimination he has continually had to face. His decision is shocking, but not a surprise. And as a narrative, there's no need for the audience to believe he is stupid for believing Iago, or for him to act out of character when he kills Desdemona. We see where the story is heading, and much like Othello, there is nothing we can do to change the outcome. Thousands of years of evolution have installed within us a need to conform to the roles set out by society, to obey those in power. We are socialized to think certain ways, and that in turn limits the decisions that we can make. And if we take a look at our biological makeup, we have identified genes which make us prone to mental illness, especially the small alleles on the 5-HHT serotonin gene, aggression, which is the warrior gene, hormones linked to love, oxytocin, don't you know, happiness, dopamine, and pro-social behavior, serotonin. I just like showing how much I know about psychology. Whether you subscribe to biological, behaviorist, or social cognitive theory, one common thread becomes clear. We have a limited amount of control over our lives. There are equal parts of free will and determinism in everything we do. Other writers may create characters who will do the most outrageous things because it's fun to watch. But Shakespeare crafts real people, men and women struggling against society, destiny, their own morals and beliefs. These characters are presented with decisions that test them, change them, and sometimes ultimately destroy them. And these characters are exciting and real. We want to know more about them, watch them, become them. Any actor can name at least 3 Shakespeare characters they have always wanted to play, and that is something that can rarely be said of any other playwright. Sure, Shakespeare has a masterful command of language, but without the characters to speak them, he would be lost to the annals of time, his work slipping into obscurity, the destiny of so many lesser writers. Thank you. Any questions? No. I'm going to go off stage now. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This concludes our first night of talks. We are back here at St. Dunstan's Church on Wednesday, so this Wednesday from 7:30 to 9, and we're going to have the lovely Nick Surridge talking about Midsummer's Night Dream. We're going to have Sarah Lockyer talking about The Changeling, and we're going to have John Crofts talking about Henry V. So I hope to see you all back here. Don't forget, we will be selling tickets for our shows: Henry V, The Changeling, Don Quixote, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer's Night Dream, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. So if you want to get ahead of the curve and buy tickets with us today, we'll be down there. In any case, you can always buy tickets at the Groombridge website. Okay, thank you everyone so much for coming. It was lovely to have you here.